Well, thank you. Thank all you guys for getting up this morning a little bit early. And had a birthday not long ago, and they're starting to pile up. And so you always think you're younger than you really are. And this was driven home to me not long ago. I was asked to go visit somebody in a nursing home. It's a very large nursing home. So I was wandering around trying to find the room, and I was having some trouble finding it. And finally I saw this nice little lady coming down the hallway, and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm looking for this room and I can't find it." And she said, "Oh, you poor dear." She said, "You just go to the front desk and they'll tell you who you are." And so when that kind of stuff starts happening to you, you know you're getting old. And so sometimes things really aren't as they seem. And heard about a guy in Omaha not long ago. This guy had been out of work for several months, and we had looked everywhere. And then one day he was driving by the zoo, and there was a sign out in front said "Help Wanted." And so he went in and inquired about the job. And the director of the zoo actually interviewed him, and he said, "You know, we've had a problem here. We lost our gorilla. Gorilla died. And we've looked everywhere, and we can't find a real gorilla. And it's hard to be a first-class zoo without a gorilla. And so we don't know what to do, but, you know, we have this gorilla suit. And that's the job. Somebody's going to have to dress up in a gorilla suit and pretend to be a real gorilla until we find one." Well, the guy wasn't wild about the job, but he really needed work, so he said, "Okay, I'll try it." So he took the suit home and practiced a little bit, came to work, and nobody seemed to have any idea it wasn't a real gorilla. Things went pretty good. But then after a while, he got kind of bored. There's only so many things you can do as a gorilla in a zoo. And so he had this idea, and he went in to see the director of the zoo, and he said, "How would it be if we built a big trapeze? And I swing back and forth over all the other animals' cages and spice up my act." And the guy said, "Well, yeah, I think we could do that." So they built this huge trapeze. He was swinging back and forth over the other cages and drawing some pretty good crowds, and things were really going well. And then one day a tragedy happened. The swing broke. He fell right on his head in the lion's cage, and he was knocked cold. And when he came to, the lion was standing over him on all fours looking down at him. And of course he forgot all about being a gorilla and began to holler for help. And he said, "Help, help, somebody save me." And the lion looked down at him and he said, "Shut up, stupid, or you're going to ruin this for everybody." And so sometimes things really aren't as they seem. And I think that's true for a lot of our young people in the United States. Because on the surface, every young person in the United States has access to an education, and that's not true in most other countries. Every young person has some type of health care available, even if it's just an emergency room. Nobody's left to die on the streets. Some kids probably would like more to eat than they have, but nobody starves. Most every young person has some kind of discretionary wealth. They probably have a cell phone, they have the right kind of tennis shoes, and they're not in abject poverty. And so that's not true most places in the world. So on the one hand, you'd say, well, things are really going pretty good. But on the other hand, I guess over 36 years of coaching, I saw a lot of changes. Started in 1962 at the University of Nebraska. Actually, first month that Bob Devaney had come to Nebraska, I went in and talked to him about being a graduate assistant coach. And so back in the early 60s, things were quite different. When we went out to recruit, we very seldom ran across a young man recruiting that wasn't growing up under the same roof with both biological parents. As time went on, that began to change, and we began to see more and more kids who were growing up in single-parent families And actually, we had a few that grew up with no parents. And so the family structure changed. There are currently 26 million fatherless kids in our country. And over half of our young people grow up, at least part of their childhood, without both biological parents. And that would have been maybe 10% back in the early 60s. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, we saw the drug culture hit. And in the early 60s, I'd never heard of methamphetamine, never heard of cocaine, never heard of fentanyl. And certainly today, almost every middle school young person has had a chance to be participating in some type of substance abuse, and that would not have been true back in those days. And then some of the media images that kids are exposed to on television, some of the movies, some of the internet sites, some of the music, some of the video games they play, simply could not have been allowed in the public domain 30, 40 years ago. And so they're inundated with messages that aren't probably as wholesome as we'd like them to be. So that has changed. And so a lot of changes have occurred in our culture. And so back in 1991, I came home from football practice one day, and my wife, Nancy, had been watching a segment of a television program, I think it was 60 Minutes, and on that program was an elderly gentleman named Eugene Lang. Eugene Lang had been asked to go back and speak to his middle school graduation, 8th grade graduation. And he was kind of struck by the changes because when he'd gone to school at that school, it was pretty new. It was in the suburbs, fairly affluent area. And now the thing had changed. The school was much older, now in the inner city. And so he was struck by the changes in demographics. And he asked the principal, he said, "How many of these kids do you think will go on to college?" And the principal said, "Well, if we're lucky, maybe one will go on to college." That really struck him because when he'd gone to school there, almost everybody was planning on going to college. And so kind of on a whim, he got up in front of the students and he said, "You know, if you kids will graduate from high school and stay out of trouble, I'll pay your way to college." He'd been in business, had some patents, and done well in the business world. And so Nancy was kind of impressed by that, and she said, "Is there something like that we could do?" I said, "Well, Nancy, I'm not quite ready to put an elementary school through college at this point, but I'll see what we can do." And so I got in front of the football team the next day. I said, "How many of you guys would be willing to serve as a mentor to some 7th or 8th grade boys in Lincoln Public Schools?" And 22 hands went up. And so we said, "Okay, we'll go to the public schools and we'll see what we can do." And they very quickly found 22 7th or 8th grade boys who would like a mentor. And so we had no idea what we were doing. We just said, spend some time with them at least once a week, bring them to practice if you want, take them to a movie, study with them, whatever, but just see them once a week. And once a month we'd get them all together and we'd have some pizza like this morning. And we'd play some basketball and have a speaker. And things seemed to be going pretty well. But after a couple of years, I got a little bit worried because these guys were now 15 going on 16. And at that time, you could drop out of school at age 16. So I got them all together, got as many parents in the room as I could. And I launched my political career. And I hate to mention that I was in politics for a while, because politicians are not always looked upon with great regard at this time. But you know what a lot of politicians do? They make promises they can't keep. Well, that's what I did. I got in front of these guys and I said, "If you guys will stay out of trouble, graduate from high school, we'll pay your way to college." The only problem was we didn't have the money, and we had no idea where the money was going to come from. But after 2 or 3 years, we had raised about $300,000, and that was the money. So these kids got to be seniors in high school, And we were really pleased because of the 22, 21 graduated on time. That really surprised us because from that group we thought maybe we'd be doing pretty well if we got 2/3 of them graduated. And then of the 22, 18 went on to college, and we thought maybe 4 or 5 would go on. And so again, we were surprised. And so we thought, well, maybe there's something to this. And so we began to expand the program. We didn't have enough football players to mentor large numbers. We expanded first in Lincoln, then across the state, then into other states. And so the figures you heard earlier were not quite accurate. We're mentoring 10,000 kids this year, and we're in 163 school districts, and we are in 5 states. But of course, 90% of those kids are in Nebraska. So I guess the question you might say, well, okay, you're asking me to consider being a mentor and seeing a young person once a week during the school year, but does it work? And so we've gathered data now for the last 12 years. Started out with Gallup gathering the data. We've gathered our own data since that time. And it's been pretty consistent year after year. And about 85% of the matches, we find that attendance improves. That sounds like a really simple thing and probably a little thing. But when attendance improves and grades improve, graduation rates improve, the percentage of kids going on to college improves. A young person who has a mentor is 56% more likely to go on to college, some type of post-secondary education, than someone from similar circumstances who does not have a mentor. So the odds just about double of going on to post-secondary education if you have a mentor. Our graduation rate in teammates is 91%. And that's not overwhelming, but it's better than the state average, better than the national average, probably a little better than the average even here in Ashland, Greenwood. But the important thing to realize is that about 70% of our kids are from single-parent families, and about 70-75% live below the poverty line. And so with that particular demographic makeup, our graduation rate would expect to be somewhere in the 75-70% range. We certainly increase graduation rates. So there are some academic improvements, but it's important to realize that this is not a tutoring program. So you don't have to know calculus. You don't have to know how to conjugate a verb. Hopefully you could, but you're not required to. And so it's simply building a relationship, and it's simply a matter of being consistent with that young person. The second thing that we found was that behavior improves. In about 85% of the matches, there's less classroom disruption, fewer trips to the principal's office, less substance abuse, less teenage pregnancy, less criminal activity, gang membership, and so on. And so I think most of you would say, well, that's probably a good thing. And then we also found, and this was something we had not anticipated, that in almost every case, young people become more hopeful, more optimistic about the future. And hope is a very powerful thing. If you don't have hope in your life, if you can't see some light at the other end of the tunnel, you're going to fill your life with something. And usually that's pretty destructive stuff. And so hope is really powerful. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as time goes on. But kids who have a mentor have hope in their life, because a mentor can show them the way through, that things can get better, that they are not necessarily the victim of their current circumstance. So anyway, the question, I guess, would be, how does it work? So we decided early on that we'd be a school-based mentoring program. So all the mentoring occurs in the school. And we like that for safety reasons. And so we've mentored over 35,000 kids now since 1991, and we've not had one single case of abuse. Because when you're mentoring in a school, there's all kinds of people around. You're not off by yourself. And so there's some jeopardy for the mentee if you're alone with an adult. But there's also jeopardy for the mentor. Because if you make a comment that that young person misunderstands, you give them a hug or whatever and they don't quite understand what your intent is, sometimes that's a little bit hazardous for the mentor as well. And so we think safety is critical, and that cuts our costs down because we have to have liability insurance. And so in a school setting, our liability insurance is way lower. So our average cost per match is about $500 per year per mentee. The national average is $1,650 per year per mentee. So our dollars go further. And also in a school setting, if there's a problem, young person maybe has insufficient computer skills, there's somebody in the school you can refer them to. If somebody's talking about harming themselves, there's somebody in the school you can refer them to. And so we think that there's certainly a great access to people who can help in that situation. So anyway, it's school-based, and it's once a week. We found that if you show up at least 24, 25 times in a school year, the great things begin to happen. And so consistency is really critical. And so it's easy. And we do train you, we do screening, and we give you all kinds of tools as to how to break the ice for that young person. And so I mentor a couple of kids at Lincoln Northeast. And about all I do right now is I say, well, how'd your week go? And it goes from there. And they do most of the talking, and I do a lot of listening. And so it isn't like you have to do anything magical. And the important thing to realize is that these are all kids who have said, I would like a mentor. So they're looking forward to seeing you. It isn't that they have to be convinced to be a mentee, and they're never forced to go into teammates by a judge, by a superintendent, by a principal. Nobody ever forces that relationship. So these are kids who have signed up and said, I would like a mentor. So anyway, that's kind of the nuts and bolts. So what does a mentor do? The first thing a mentor does is love the mentee. And there's a word in the Bible that I really like. It's a word for love. And I think Hollywood has kind of screwed up our idea of what love really is, because the images we have of love sometimes are pretty distorted. But this word is a Greek word. It's called agape. You probably have heard it in church at one time or another. And agape doesn't necessarily mean a warm and fuzzy feeling. It's more of a commitment. And so agape means unconditional, positive regard. It means I will the best for you. I want you to become all that you can become, all that you're capable of being. And I'll demonstrate my love for you by showing up and being consistent and serving you. And so if you think about it, the most precious gift you can give another person is not necessarily something of economic value. Sometimes we think, well, that would be a car, it would be a computer, it would be some clothing or whatever it might be. But the most precious gift that you can give another person is the gift of time. Because we can make more money, but none of us can make more time. So if you give somebody a slice of your life, something that you'll never get back, it's the most precious gift that you can give. And so that young person comes to realize that this person who has no obligation to do so, they're not a parent, they're not a grandparent, they're not a teacher, they're not a preacher, they're not paid to do this, but this person who has no obligation to serve me shows up every week, spends time with me, invests in me and cares about me. And so maybe some of these things I've heard about myself, and maybe some of these things I've thought about myself that aren't very positive or not necessarily true, because this person apparently sees something in me that brings them back every week. And so maybe I am more worthwhile than I thought, because this person loves me. And so that's the way a mentor cares for that young person. The mentor loves the mentee. And so sometimes, you've heard in the scripture, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. And you may say, well, how can that be? Because this guy lives next door to me. He never speaks, never shovels his walks, and he's just kind of a jerk. So how in the world can I love that person? Because he is, in a sense, my enemy. But you can practice this type of love. Agape, you can will the best for that person. You may not have a warm and fuzzy feeling toward him, but you cannot wish him harm. You can wish him a good outcome in his life. You can will the best for him. And so sometimes these things that we hear in the scripture seem impossible to practice. But if you have the right understanding and you understand the right word, and if you understand what agape is, you understand what Jesus was talking about. And essentially that's what he's talking about in caring for these kids. And eventually there will be a warm and fuzzy feeling, but it's more of an act of commitment. It's an act of will. And so that's the first thing. The second thing that we do, we think is very important, is to provide affirmation. And some of you maybe have experienced that in your job or maybe in your marriage or whatever. You go 2 weeks, 2 months, maybe longer than that, and nobody says a kind word. You really did a good job on this, or thanks for staying and working overtime. Thanks for taking out the garbage. Whatever it may be, there really is no kind word. And sometimes when that happens, life gets hard. And so lots of kids, for whatever reason, sometimes go pretty long periods of time without much affirmation. And so what we do is we work with strength finders from Gallup, and we identify strengths. And everyone has some strengths, have some things that they do better than other people. So for instance, one of the young guys that I'm mentoring right now, his number one strength is he's an includer. He doesn't like to see somebody being bullied. He doesn't like to see somebody being left out. So if I see him sitting by Johnny in the lunchroom on Monday, and Johnny's all by himself, and this young guy goes over and sits with him and talks to him, I'll kind of make a big deal out of it. I say, this isn't just about you sitting and having lunch with Johnny on Monday when Johnny was being left out. This is a big part of who you are. This is something that an employer is going to appreciate about you. The person you marry is going to value that quality. And so this is really a bigger deal than just that one event. And so we identify those strengths. Young guy is also somebody who's pretty strategic. He's had a lot of problems in his life. He's been pretty good at figuring out ways around those problems and how to solve those problems. So when I see him doing that, I'll make a big deal out of that, and I'll affirm that. He's also somebody who's a maximizer. He likes to see other people do well. And so he plays on a basketball team, but he hardly ever talks about his own play. He always talks about his teammates. Somebody made a great shot, somebody blocked a shot, somebody passed the ball well. And so it's almost always about other people. I'll say, this is kind of rare for a teenager to be all about other people. And this is a quality that's going to serve you well and be valued throughout your lifetime. So identify strengths and we affirm them. And I saw how powerful that was in coaching. Because if I told a player that I believed in him, then I thought someday he could be a great player. Oftentimes that guy would begin to blossom and would grow into that which he had no idea he could become. And so affirmation is something that we provide, and we identify strengths. And most successful people build on their strengths. We always think that, well, if we want to be successful, we have to identify these weaknesses that we have. We got to improve this weakness and that weakness and that weakness. But if you think about it, most successful people really don't worry too much about their weaknesses. They build on their strength. So I know Warren Buffett a little bit. I guess I'll engage in being name dropper, and we've played tennis on a couple of occasions. And I can vouch for the fact that Warren is not a great tennis player. But I will guarantee you that Warren Buffett probably hasn't spent 5 minutes worrying about his tennis game and the fact that it's not great, because what he does is more of what he does well. He's really good at sitting and reading a long period of time and looking at numbers on a sheet of paper and analyzing which business will do better in the long run than other businesses. And that's what he does more of. And so most successful people do more of what they do well, and they do less of what they don't do well. And so we try to do that with our kids, to identify their strength, make sure they build on their strengths. And so those strengths that I mentioned that this young guy has can lead to an academic major and lead to a career, because they pretty much line up with somebody being a coach or a teacher. So we talk about those strengths and where they're going to lead. And I think that's very powerful. And the last thing I'll mention, and with this I'll close, I think a mentor can do a good job of providing a vision of what's possible. And that ties into hope. Because you've heard in the scripture, it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And that's true. That's true of a country, a nation. It's true of a business, true of a football team, true of a family, true of an individual. If you have no idea where you're going, things get really rough. And so a mentor can provide a vision of what's possible. Because when you're young, when you're 10 or 12 or 15, sometimes you don't look very far down the road. The next dance, the next football game, the next test. That's about as far as you look ahead. But you as an adult have a better frame of reference. You've been around a little bit longer, and you can see what's possible further on down the road. And so vision is really critical. So I'll tell you a story about my grandfather. And this goes back quite a few years, because my grandfather's older than I, and I'm pretty old. So my grandfather had a father. He was growing up in a family back in Illinois, and his father, my great-grandfather, was a Civil War veteran, was an officer in the Union Army. And somewhat because of his war experiences, I think, he had developed a drinking problem. Probably today we would call him an alcoholic. 4 kids in the family. I don't think things were going well. And so they moved west to a homestead out in western Nebraska. You know what a homestead is. You live on the land for a year. You have the land, and the piece of ground they got wasn't particularly good. Kind of sandy soil and pretty dry climate, only about 16 inches of moisture per year. And so the future for that family probably wasn't overly bright. But one day, my grandfather was asked to give a speech. He's about the 5th grade, and I think it was at a school setting. And so in attendance that day was a circuit rider. This was a traveling preacher who went from one town to the next out in western Nebraska, a little bit of South Dakota, and also eastern Wyoming. Just happened to be there that day. And apparently my grandfather gave a pretty good speech, because this guy stayed afterwards and got my grandfather aside, and he identified his strength. And he said, you know, that was really a remarkably good speech for a 5th grader. I've never heard anybody speak that well at that age. And then he kind of painted a picture. He said, you know, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but someday I think you could be a great preacher. Of course, my grandfather never thought about being a preacher, never entered his head. But about once a month, this guy would ride that circuit, and he'd come and he'd spend some time with my grandfather, and eventually became what I guess we would call a mentor. And so my grandfather graduated from 7th grade, and that was all the grades they had there in that little town. And so that's when he went to work in those days. And this preacher said, you know, if you want to be a preacher now, you're going to have to go to high school. Well, the only problem was that the nearest high school was 100 miles away. It's up in Crawford, Nebraska, up in the northwest corner of the state. So my grandfather, because of this guy's encouragement, got on a stagecoach, went up to Crawford, got a job in a grocery store, and began to work his way through high school. And now this traveling preacher put Crawford on his itinerary. He stopped in Crawford and he spent some time with him. And my grandfather did graduate from high school, which not very many people did at that time. And now this preacher said, now you're going to have to go to college if you want to be a preacher. So with his encouragement, my grandfather went up to Alliance, got on a train, went down to Hastings, Nebraska, enrolled at Hastings College, and was a football player there. Didn't wear helmets in those days. They just grew their hair out a little bit longer. Some of you guys would have a little trouble there. And so he was the captain of his football team. He spoke 5 languages. So he'd worked at a trading post and was pretty fluent in 5 languages and fairly accomplished guy. Did go to seminary and did become a fairly well-known preacher in western Nebraska. Served a couple terms in the state legislature. And he lived a good life. And his life was certainly about 180 degrees different than it would have been if he had not met that mentor. But the story doesn't end there, you see, because a lot of you think, well, there's a lot of kids out there that could use a mentor. But if I mentor one young person, in the greater scheme of things, what difference does that make? That's just one kid. But you see, my grandfather had 5 children. And all 5 of those kids, because of his experience with that mentor, all 5 of those kids were expected to go to college. And they did go to college during the Great Depression, when again, not very many people went because there wasn't any money. And they were all expected to live a certain kind of life, a life of service. And that was unique. It affected me because as a grandson, I always looked up to and admired that grandfather and what he'd accomplished. And he was killed by lightning when I was 9. And I probably had only been in his presence maybe 5 or 6 times, but I knew about him, I knew who he was. And so he had a powerful influence on my life. He had an influence on my children because of what my grandfather represented, experience he'd had in his life. And he probably had an influence on the 2,000 odd players that I coached over all those years. I'm sure I coached them somewhat differently because of the influence of that mentor my grandfather had all those years ago. I never met that mentor. I know his name. His name was Kearns. And so there is a ripple effect. And so if you change one life for the better, it will not just end with that young person, because it will ripple on down through the generations. And so right now I'm a little bit concerned, maybe not a little bit, I'm a lot concerned about our culture, because no great civilization is any further away from dissolution than the next generation. If the next generation can't pull it off, things begin to crumble. And so I'm really concerned about what's going on in our country today. And so the best solution that I know is mentoring. It's one person at a time. And that ripple effect can be very powerful. So I'll end by just saying this. If you think about it, Jesus took 12 pretty ordinary people. And he spent 3 years with them. And he essentially mentored them. He walked with them, ate with them, talked with them. And then those people in turn influenced other people. And that rippled on down through the ages. And within a relatively short time, the Roman Empire was changed to the Holy Roman Empire under Constantine. And so you may recall the scripture where Jesus is talking, and he said this, he said, and then the Son of Man will return and gather the nations before him, and he will separate the sheep from the goats, the sheep on the right and the goats on the left. And he said, and then the righteous will come and claim their inheritance For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was sick and you cared for me. I was a stranger and you took me in. And I was in prison and you visited me. And then the righteous will say, when did we do all these things? And he said, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it unto me. And so our faith requires us not just to go sit in a pew on Sunday, and that's good, but rather our faith requires us to act this out and to care for other people. And there's lots of ways to do this. Mentoring is one of those ways. And so we'd like to encourage you to do that. We need more men mentors, need more male role models, and that could be very powerful. So thank you for listening, and thank you for having me today. And I suppose, I don't know if anybody goes to work on Saturday, but some of you do, so we better let you go. Thank you.